Okay, so this is the first of our Hammermen talks, and I entitled it Hammermen and Hammerwomen. And here you see a little indulgence, a sculpture of a woman holding a hammer and standing on an engine, and I've draped my collector's medal over her. This was a little indulgence on eBay recently. When I first joined the Hammermen, and then when I went on the master course, and now I have the honour to be collector, a number of people who didn't know any better said, "Oh, I suppose you'll be campaigning for the name of the craft to be changed." And I said, "You have got to be joking." So the title of this talk is really tongue-in-cheek, because I have no intention, and I don't imagine anybody else in the craft has any intention of changing our amazingly historic name as the Premier Craft. It would be fair to say that it would be considered not the first thing you think of for women as recently as 1945, when this cartoon was published in a book published by the Electrical Association for Women on their 25th anniversary. Young ladies were supposed to swoon elegantly at the sight of a mouse, and the use of a hammer belonged exclusively to the man. Well, even in 1945, of course, that was absolute nonsense, as we'll see later on. I'm starting almost at the end of our story, because I felt that it was only fair to our first female full member, because of her significance and importance, to put her first. So in 2002, we admitted our first female official member, honorary member actually, HRH, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne. And she came to the Hammermen dinner that year, and you can see a not great photograph of her receiving her certificate. And this has been screen grabbed out of the magazine for that year. If anybody's got better photos of that episode, it would be good, because I haven't found a decent picture of her actual inaugural visit. She has been back a couple of times since, and in fact this is typical of Princess Anne. I had the honour to meet her last year. She is one of these people who doesn't take something on unless she's going to take it seriously, and she is the most impressively well-informed person, particularly on science, STEM subjects. So she was a very appropriate person to pick to be our first female member. But how did we get there? Well, I have to say it's been a bit of a rocky road. As early as 1919, many of the crafts were admitting women to be Burgess sisters. Now, this did not mean that they were members of any of the relevant incorporations, but they were kind of associated with those incorporations by becoming Burgess sisters. And in 1921, the first two Burgess sisters associated with the Hammermen were admitted, a woman called Lilias Glenn as a daughter-in-law, and another woman called Julia Cooper Douglas Reed. Most of the crafts at that time started to have Burgess sisters, but it was a purely honorary thing. They had absolutely no role in their respective crafts at that time. And I have to say that I didn't borrow all the minutes. I only borrowed our own minutes going back to 1995. But as early as 1995, we were already having at least one female winner of a Hammermen Award every year. So probably before that, but I haven't gone back into our minutes. What did surprise me is that the Hammermen dinners continued to be completely all-male affairs until at least 1996, when one or two women kind of sneaked in. There was a female speaker in 1996, and some women came as guests without their host having remarked to the clerk that they had invited a woman. But technically these were all male dinners as late as that, and I found that really surprising. There's a very good document on the Trades House library site about the history of females being admitted to the various crafts. And I don't know who did it, but somebody's gone back through all the minutes. And there were meetings of the Trades House in 1976, 1980, 1986, 1995, 1996, 2000, 2001, at which the whole thing was chewed over at length and sometimes with some considerable heat. In 2002, after this had been backwards and forwards, and sometimes the Hammermen were on the positive side, and sometimes further back in time we were on the negative side, but by 2002, we were doing the pushing to get women admitted. And the problem was that the Trades House position was that legally all the crafts had to agree or none of them could do it. And the Masons were holding out and holding out. And at a meeting in the summer of 2002, it got very heated indeed. The Masons said, if you let women into the crafts, it's the thin end of the wedge. I have no idea what wedge they had in mind, but anyway. And it got so heated that the Trades House clerk at the time advised the deacon of the Hammermen that if he had any occasion to disagree with the Masons on this, he ought to take them to court about it. At which point the deacon of the Hammermen and one or two other crafts left the Trades House meeting in disgust. Fortunately, ruffled feathers were smoothed over, and in October 2002, the Trades House meeting finally unanimously agreed that women could be admitted to those crafts that wished to do so. And as we've seen, Princess Anne was our first honorary female member. But before all that, I want to introduce you to a woman that actually ex-deacon Colin Botfield alerted me to. This story basically starts in the pages of Harry Lumsden's book about our history, which is just as well because he managed to have access to sets of minutes, some of which are no longer extant, and some of what he puts in his book is the only remaining printed record of what happened in certain times. So we think that Margaret Coates was the first woman to be granted what was then called the freedom to trade as a hammerman. Long before women were admitted as full members of the incorporation, she was also a friend and supporter of the poet Thomas Campbell. Now, her surname, Coates, is spelt with or without an E. Even her first name, Margaret, is spelt in a number of different ways. But she was the only child of a man called William Coates. And she was born in about 1765, probably in Glasgow, where her father was a merchant. Her mother may have been a woman called Jean Jameson, but we don't know anything about her. Margaret herself never married. We don't know what she looked like. We don't know what her father looked like. But this is a dress of the correct period. And on the right is a quite well-known painting of a woman shopkeeper in the High Street in the exact period when Margaret was a young adult. So not quite of the same class, but not far off. So this is the sort of clothing that Margaret might have worn. Her father William was a real pillar of the community. He was not merely a member of the Merchants' House, but in 1787 was its president and the Dean of Guild. He was also on the boards of the town hospital, various other charities, member of the Hodgepodge Club, which was one of the many elite men's drinking and dining clubs that were popular at the time. It is said that William was amongst the group of citizens who put up some of the money and goods demanded by the followers of Bonnie Prince Charlie when they marched into Glasgow in 1745, and was one of the hostages taken by those troops to ensure the delivery of the items demanded. William Coates is listed in the very earliest of the Glasgow directories as a merchant living in Ingram Street. And from 1799, he's listed as owning a brass foundry in Saracen Lane off the Gallowgate, where he was taxed for owning 2 horses. The taxation rolls, as ever, are very useful records. He had business interests in America and Jamaica and is known to have had a sequence of complex and overlapping partnerships from 1769 with various other Glasgow merchants. And the lending of credit between all these people led to a very complicated lawsuit at the time of his death. And Margaret, as her father's executrix, had to deal with all of that. He was also a partner in the Glasgow Tan Works, which was sort of in the top left-hand quadrant of this map. It was a very substantial company indeed. In addition to the obvious tannery and leather goods work, it was also Glasgow's first de facto bank, and other partners included many of Glasgow's famous tobacco lords. Its counting house was only a few doors along the Gallowgate from William Coates's own premises in Saracen Lane. This is what Saracen Lane looks like now, and the modern Saracen Head pub. It's still a sort of quasi-industrial area, and that red brick building towards the back of the lane is some kind of light industrial unit. So Margaret, perhaps I should go back a bit and talk about the foundry a bit. The foundry was listed from 1799, mainly with William and his brother Archibald being the proprietors, but in 1809 and 1810, it's listed under Margaret's name as Coates M, Brass Founder, Saracen Lane. It was also known as Brass Bell Lane, and there were other metalworks in the lane. The nickname seems to be confirmed by the amount of bell making equipment listed when it was finally auctioned off by a subsequent owner, one Walter McFarlane, before clearing out the foundry for his own use. Now, this is the Walter McFarlane that went on to take the Saracen foundry from this tiny little lane up into the north of the city, where it became absolutely jihoogynous and very, very famous worldwide as a foundry. So in 1808, Margaret was living in Carlton Place on the south bank of the Clyde and running the foundry herself. As a wealthy woman, this was a lovely place to live, Carlton Place, consisting of two very long, dignified neoclassical terraces designed by the architect Peter Nicholson, and they're still there. We don't know when she started to run the foundry, but she was listed in 1809 and 1810, some 8 years after her father died. And this is an extract from Lumsden's History of the Hammermen of Glasgow, which I'll read. The question of admitting a lady member occupied the serious attention of the craft for over a year, and you can just imagine how that one went backwards and forwards. This was Miss Margaret Coates of Carlton Place, the orphan daughter and heiress of the foundry of her father in Saracen's Lane, who had begun to carry on business in the cast iron and brass foundry line within the royalty, without having paid a freedom fine. On the 14th of October, 1808, the clerk writes, requesting that Mr. Wilson or some other person for Miss Coates would come forward to the next meeting and pay the dues. And on the 2nd of May, 1809, her agent having offered £2 for her freedom fine, as if she had been entered into the Hammermen as a son, a committee was appointed to insist upon the payment of 10 guineas as a composition for entitling Miss Coates to carry on business, in consideration that she cannot be entered as a member of the corporation. On her paying the said moderate and reasonable sum to the collector, they authorise her to carry on business accordingly, as a brass and iron founder and smith during her life, without the necessity of her making an essay piece or paying quarter accounts. It would appear that Miss Coates finally accepted these terms, as 2 months later we find it minuted that the meeting did find the said Miss Coates and the sum of £2 sterling for each of 3 journeymen enticed away from Moses McCulloch, ironmonger, by her doer or manager. So this was quite an exceptional concession for the Hammermen. because obviously we would not admit women properly for another couple of centuries. And although 10 guineas was then what was then worth about £850 at today's rates, it was not totally unheard of in other trades guilds across Britain and even in Glasgow that widows or other female relatives might be allowed to trade in the deceased male relative's place for a while. But it was certainly extremely rare occurrence and much rarer in Scotland than in England. The statement that she paid a freedom fine as if she was a son shows that at the very least they were conceding that she could trade freely, and she also had to take responsibility for the actions of her manager in regards to employing journeymen and indeed apprentices. So that's where the Saracens foundry was in the middle of the 19th century, just before it moved to the north of the city. And there's a photo of the gate of William McFarlane's famous foundry. So I mentioned that she was a patron of the poet Thomas Campbell, and he was the son of a tobacco merchant, so very much of the same social class. He was slightly younger than her, born in Glasgow, and was considered both academic and artistic from an early age. And he had a critical success with the publication of his very early poem, The Pleasures of Hope, when he was only 22. Contemporaries such as Lord Byron considered him better than Wordsworth and Coleridge, but his reputation declined even within his own lifetime. And although he's now considered a minor Scottish poet, we do still have this statue of him in George Square, which is more than we have any image of Margaret. Thomas and Margaret were very much from the same class, although she was a bit older, so it's not surprising that they were friends. The library at Yale University has a small collection of letters from Thomas Campbell to Margaret Coates in the years 1800 to 1802. She was apparently an admirer of his work and also a patron, supporting him with gifts of money at a period when he was traveling in Europe. The final letter in the collection from August 1802, he's home again in Britain, and he goes on at some length on the virtues of the true friend and expresses the wish to visit her sometime. However, in the following year, Campbell got married, but Margaret's own life was going to take a darker turn as a few years later she became mentally ill. From about the time of Margaret's father's death in 1802, she seems to have lived most of the rest of her life with Mr. and Mrs. Stirling, this is Andrew and Anne Stirling of Drumpellier House, North Lanarkshire. Anne was almost exactly the same age as Margaret. They were again from the same sort of class, although the Stirlings were definitely a cut above them. But they must have been friends from girlhood, because she started to live with them, both in Scotland and later on when they moved to their home in Surrey at Purbright Lodge. Two of the sons of Anne and Andrew Stirling were in business as a company called Stirling Brothers and Company, and her own business and financial affairs were very much entangled with them. They were definitely involved in the slave trade, as they're recorded in the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database as having slaves in both Barbados and British Guiana. And this involved her again in many court cases, not just the one about her father's businesses, but their businesses too. And it wouldn't be at all surprising, really, if the stress of all these court cases was such a worry that it made her mentally unwell. These are documents held in the National Archives down at Kew, which are the documents known as a Commission to Inquire of the Lunacy of Margaret Coates. There is evidence that she suffered from some kind of mental affliction in the latter part of her life, possibly from 1816, when this commission sat to consider her situation. In 1802, when she made a will, nobody queried her ability to do so. In 1808 and 1810, when she's known to have been running the foundry in Saracen's Lane, again, nobody seems to have queried her mental capacity to make decisions or to run it. But this paper, which consists of 2 parchments, makes actually practically no comment about her state of mind. The vast majority of the text you can see in that upper document is taken up with confirming the probity, honesty, and virtues of the people who are the members of the commission, all men, I may add, and is only a bald statement that it is not known how she became a lunatic, but that she does not enjoy periods of lucidity and is therefore not capable of managing her own property and wealth. No evidence is provided. There are no minutes of the meeting, as there are for some others. And it is known that at this time it was not unusual for women to be declared mentally incapable just to get hold of their money. And it's not impossible that's what happened in this particular case. So she was declared insane. And at this time she was living, this is Purbright House on the left, she was living with the Sterlings down in Surrey. And she lived the rest of her life from about 1816 onwards down there until her death. And she's buried in St Michael's Churchyard in Purbright. She had a reasonable income from rentals of properties in London, the equivalent of about £138,000 a year in today's money. So the possibility of getting the use of that money was non-trivial. She died in 1835 at the age of 69, and as with her father, so with Margaret's own will, a court case ensued. And there were arguments between her former partners, the Sterling brothers, and her factors, a company called Horn and Hosier, debating as to who actually had the right to her property, because she had no living relatives as far as we know. Despite her rather sad later life and many problems, I think Margaret is still notable for her involvement in the early industrial life of Glasgow, unusual for a woman then, and for at least another 100 years or so after her death, and much longer again before women would enter the Hammermen. And she remains our earliest recorded female member of any status other than pensioner. Now, when I became collector, I started making contact with some of the other active incorporations of Hammermen in Scotland, as indeed some recent deacons have done. This is a list of the places where there are active incorporations. Not all of them have female members. I'm not going to name and shame any of them. Some have open female membership to both operative and people who are not involved in engineering in any way, on exactly the same basis as we do. Others maintain a very traditional setup where only those people involved in the hammering trades or an apprentice can join. And so some of them have no female members yet. And some of these in this list still are all men. There were Hammermen in a huge, much longer list of places back in the day, but most of them faded away over the years. So, for instance, Couros had its own tiny incorporation of Hammermen, and they only made girdles, griddle pans. That's all they made, famous for it apparently. Most of them died out in the 18th and 19th centuries, and these are the ones we've got left which are still active, which I think is quite impressive. The Selkirk lot are very impressive. They've taken over a derelict building and they're doing it up to become the Selkirk Trades House, which really all kudos to them. So we've talked about the oldest known woman involved with the Hammermen. I thought it's only fair to finish up with, as far as I know, the oldest, or very nearly the oldest, Hammermen, certainly the oldest female Hammermen, our delightful Dr. Janet Harvey, who we welcomed into the craft a couple of years ago, and who is still going strong, still living independent life in Glasgow. And on the left, you can see her with her wee hammer, which she still has left from her wartime work in the shipyards. And a wonderful example to us all that it's never too late to become a hammerman. And so as collector, it's my duty to try and recruit people into the Hammermen. And so this is my recruiting slide. If anybody listening is not yet a member of the incorporation, we would love to have you. No need to ever have used a hammer or even to own a hammer. No need to even happen to live in Glasgow. We're very welcoming, and the forms are online, and if anybody's struggling with the forms, I'm happy to talk them through it. We would love to see more members of the Hammermen join us during this rather awkward year.